December 20th, 1944. The freezing fog settling over the Belgian town of Bastogne was so dense that a man holding his rifle could barely see the tip of his own barrel. In the tree line known as the Bois Jacques, just outside the in Major Kurt Kuhne of the German 26th Volksgrenadier Division listened to the silence. It was a heavy, suffocating silence. It was the kind of quiet that, according to German military doctrine, only occurred when an enemy was completely demoralized, freezing, and waiting to be overrun. The mathematics of the siege were entirely in the Germans' favor. The United States 101st Airborne Division, along with remnants of armored units, was completely surrounded. The German encirclement was an iron ring of armor and artillery. The Americans had no winter clothing, negligible artillery ammunition, and no physical way out. In the minds of the German commanders, the Americans were not an army anymore. They were prisoners who just hadn't formally surrendered yet. Before we step into the freezing darkness of the Ardennes to see exactly what the Germans found waiting for them, we want to know who is keeping this history alive. And the story of the Second War is the story of ordinary people enduring the unimaginable. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family served in it. And if you believe the true history of the U.S. Armed Forces needs to be told, without Hollywood embellishments, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. The German operational plan for the night of December 20th was straightforward. And General Heinz Kokott, commanding the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, ordered his infantry to conduct nighttime combat patrols into the American lines. The objective was not a full-scale assault, but psychological attrition. And German doctrine dictated that when you probe a surrounded, exhausted enemy in the pitch black, the enemy reacts defensively. They cower in their foxholes. They fire wildly into the dark, giving away their positions and wasting their precious ammunition. And Major Kuhne's men, veterans who had fought in the sprawling, terrifying night battles of the Eastern Front, stripped off their heavy gear. They painted their faces with ash and grease. They moved into the snow-covered pine forest with the silent and practiced lethality of hunters, stepping into a trap they themselves had laid. They expected to find shivering Americans huddled together for warmth. They expected to find sentries asleep on their feet, broken by the -20-degree temperatures. Instead, as the German patrol crept past the first line of pine trees, the silence of the woods was broken by a sound that the German veterans did not expect. It was not the panicked crack of an American M1 Garand rifle firing blindly into the shadows. It was the metallic, mechanical clink of a combat knife being drawn from a scabbard, originating from directly behind the German patrol. The German lead scout froze. On the Eastern Front, a surrounded Soviet unit would dig deeply into the earth and wait for the artillery. But as the German Volksgrenadiers strained their eyes against the freezing fog, they realized with a sudden, spiking terror that the Americans were not in their foxholes. A 101st Airborne Division had not adopted a defensive posture. In complete defiance of standard military logic, the surrounded, freezing, outgunned American paratroopers were actively patrolling the woods in front of their own lines, and they were conducting aggressive, silent hunting expeditions in the dark. The German patrol had not snuck up on a defensive perimeter. They had walked directly into an American ambush. In the span of 30 seconds, and the quiet of the Bois Jacques erupted into absolute localized chaos. But it was not the chaotic fire of panicked men. The German survivors of the patrol would later report to Major Kuhne that the Americans moved in the dark with a predatory calmness, and the paratroopers did not yell. They did not retreat toward Bastogne. When the shooting started, the Americans actually advanced toward the German muzzle flashes. A German corporal who crawled back to the command post with a shattered shoulder gave a frantic, breathless report that forced General Kokott to fundamentally reassess his enemy. The corporal stated that his squad had been engaged by what they assumed was a massive American force, but when the flares briefly illuminated the woods, he realized they were fighting only a handful of men. "They do not act like men who are trapped," the corporal reported to his interrogating officer. "They act like we are the ones trapped in the woods with them. When we fell back, they did not stay in their lines. They followed us into the dark." The German High Command had calculated that the siege of Bastogne would be a matter of waiting for the Americans to freeze or starve. But as the first night of the true siege settled over the Ardennes, the German officers looking into the tree line realized a terrifying psychological truth. The men of the 101st Airborne did not view the encirclement as a desperate survival situation. They viewed it as a target-rich environment where the enemy was conveniently located in every single direction. December 22, 1944. Deep inside the concrete command bunker of the German 26th Volksgrenadier Division, and General Heinz Koch stared at a situation map that was rapidly becoming obsolete. According to every logistical calculation made by the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, Bastogne should have fallen 3 days ago, and the road junction was the beating heart of the regional transportation network. Without it, the entire German armored spearhead pushing toward the Meuse River was bottlenecked on narrow, icy forest tracks. And General Koch had deployed 3 full divisions to crush the 101st Airborne Division. He had massed artillery, armored assault guns, and battalions of fanatical grenadiers. Yet, as he listened to the morning reports from the frontline commanders, holding the sectors around Foy and Noville, a profound professional frustration set in. The reports did not describe a coherent, organized front line. They described something erratic and ghost-like and deeply unsettling. A company commander from the 901st Panzer Grenadier Regiment submitted an after-action log stating that his men had attempted to establish a heavy machine gun nest in a farmhouse on the northeastern perimeter. Within 20 minutes of setting up the tripod without a single round being fired by the Americans, the entire German crew had been eliminated by precise, silent mortar fire. A German officer noted that the Americans possessed almost no heavy artillery ammunition left, a fact confirmed by intercepted radio chatter. So where had the mortar rounds come from? The intelligence officer investigating the incident discovered a chilling reality. A squad of American paratroopers, freezing and half-starved, had manually dragged a lightweight 60mm mortar across the snow-choked ravines and, creeping within 50 yards of the German position in broad daylight, set up their weapon in a drainage ditch, fired exactly 4 high-explosive rounds with surgical precision, and vanished back into the woods before the Germans could even traverse their gun turrets. In the rigid taxonomy of German military doctrine, an encircled force facing starvation and freezing temperatures is supposed to conserve its energy. It is supposed to huddle in deep foxholes, ration its fuel and ammunition, and wait for external relief. This is what the Soviet forces did when surrounded. This is what the British did at Dunkirk. It is a predictable and mathematically modeled response to the horror of encirclement. The 101st Airborne Division was operating on an entirely different psychological frequency. They were treating the siege not as a prison, but as a staging area for relentless and localized attrition. Major Kurt Kuhn, reviewing the compiled unit logs of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division that afternoon, wrote a private memorandum to his staff that would later be captured by Allied intelligence officers. He attempted to analyze what he called Die amerikanische Unberechenbarkeit, the American unpredictability. The enemy within the perimeter does not respect the tactical reality of his situation. While our forces maintain a structured, sequential siege line, the American paratroopers behave as though the encirclement does not exist. They conduct offensive patrols in sectors where they are outmatched 4-1. They attack supply columns with small arms fire, loot our rations under the cover of artillery smoke, and retreat only to reappear on our flank 2 hours later. We are expending critical ammunition on phantoms. That word, phantoms, was not used out of fear, but out of professional exasperation. The German military machine was built on synchronization. In the Wehrmacht attacked, every battalion, every battery of artillery, and every panzer platoon moved according to a meticulously timed schedule. Every enemy reaction was anticipated, slotted into a pre-calculated matrix, and crushed by superior doctrine. But the paratroopers at Bastogne tore up the matrix. On the afternoon of December 22nd, a German emissary carrying a white flag approached the American lines on the southern perimeter near Vaux. They brought the famous ultimatum drafted by General von Lüttwitz, demanding the immediate, unconditional surrender of Bastogne to prevent the complete annihilation of the American forces. And the German officers delivered the formal document to the acting American commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. They expected a frantic negotiation. They expected a rattled, desperate general calculating how many of his dying men he could save. McAuliffe's legendary single-word response, "nuts," was initially mistranslated by German intelligence officers as an idiom of defiance and a childish insult. But as the hours ticked by and no white flag of surrender appeared from the American perimeter, and the German high command realized the horrifying truth behind the word, it wasn't an insult. It was a complete and total rejection of the premise that surrender was even a theoretical option. General Cocotte, in realizing that psychological warfare and ultimatums had failed, ordered a coordinated, division-wide armored assault for the following morning. If the Americans refused to surrender, they would be mechanically disassembled, square block by square block, and tank by tank. What the German generals did not understand was that the men holding those frozen foxholes in the Bois Jacques and around Foy had already crossed a psychological Rubicon. They were not fighting for a tactical victory in Europe, and they were fighting for the man in the hole next to them. Private First Class Donald Burgett of Company A, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, documented the mindset of the men inside the perimeter during those freezing December nights. They were sleeping in frozen mud, eating cold K-rations flavored with frozen grease, and wrapping their feet in burlap sacks to stave off trench foot. Yet, when the German artillery shells began screaming overhead and tearing the ancient oaks of the Ardennes into deadly shrapnel, the paratroopers did not cower. As soon as the barrage lifted, knowing that the German infantry was about to follow in the smoke, the men of the 101st would crawl out of their shattered holes and clean the ice from the bolts of their M1 Garons, and wait with a cold, predatory patience. They were freezing, starving, and outgunned. But as the German infantry learned every single night when they stepped into the blackness of the Ardennes forest, in the perimeter at Bastogne was not a cage holding the Americans in. It was a cage holding the Germans in with them. December 25, 1944. In the German cultural tradition, Christmas is a deeply sacred holiday. But in the frozen forests surrounding Bastogne, it was designated by the German High Command as the day the American perimeter had to be annihilated. General Heinz Cocotte of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, acting under immense pressure from Field Marshal Hasso von Manteuffel, coordinated what was supposed to be the definitive perimeter-cracking assault. Cocotte had studied the American defenses for a week. He knew the 101st Airborne was completely exhausted. They were suffering from severe frostbite, surviving on melted snow, and running out of medical supplies. By every standard of military modeling, their psychological breaking point had been reached 72 hours ago. At 0300 hours on Christmas morning, the German assault began. But Cocotte did not launch a reckless, division-wide frontal charge. He executed a highly concentrated armor-heavy penetration on the northwestern edge of the perimeter, near the village of Champs. A strike force of German panzers and elite panzer grenadiers tore out of the freezing darkness. The German tanks, painted bright white to camouflage them against the snow, advanced silently until they were right on top of the American lines. To the German commanders watching the operation unfold, the opening phase was a complete tactical success, and the white-painted panzers successfully breached the perimeter, rolling directly through the frozen foxholes of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment and pushing toward the center of Bastogne. Standard infantry doctrine dictates that when enemy heavy armor successfully penetrates your line, the infantry holding that line must fall back immediately to prevent being surrounded and crushed from behind. And the German panzer grenadiers, the infantry trailing behind the tanks, surged forward, expecting to pour into the massive gap their armor had just created and roll up the shattered American flank. And what happened next fundamentally broke the German understanding of infantry combat. As the German panzers thundered past the American foxholes, the men of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment did not retreat. They simply ducked down and let the 60-ton machines roll over their positions, and then stood right back up in their holes. The American paratroopers deliberately allowed the German armor to break into their rear area. But the moment the German infantry tried to follow the tanks through the breach, the 101st Airborne opened fire. The gap slammed shut. The German panzer grenadiers were caught completely by surprise. Instead of pouring through a routed American line, they found themselves walking into a devastating crossfire from men who had just been overrun by tanks but refused to acknowledge it. In the span of 30 minutes, the German infantry assault was completely obliterated. Meanwhile, the German panzers that had successfully broken into the American rear found themselves entirely unsupported. Without their infantry to protect them, the German tanks became massive steel targets. The American paratroopers, alongside elements of the 10th Armored Division, hunted the panzers down through the snowy fields behind the lines. By mid-morning, every single German tank that had penetrated the perimeter was a smoldering, burning wreck. Back at the German command post, General Cocotte listened to the radio traffic devolve into static. His elite strike force had been wiped out. The perimeter was sealed again. his timetable, mandated by Hitler himself, was now completely in tatters. After the war, and the captured German generals sat in their comfortable Allied holding cells writing their memoirs and analyzing the European theater. They were forced to explain the disaster at Bastogne. General Cocotte, who had spent a week throwing everything the Third Reich had against a starving, freezing division of light infantry, grudgingly acknowledged the horrifying reality of what he had faced. He wrote that the American paratrooper was tough, stubborn, and death-disdaining. Death-disdaining. It is a profound, terrifying phrase for a military commander to use. It means that the German military machine, and built entirely on the premise of inflicting psychological terror and breaking the enemy's will to survive, had run into an enemy that simply did not care. When the relief columns of Patton's Third Army finally broke through to Bastogne on December 26th, and the legend of the 101st Airborne was cemented in the American public consciousness. But the truest measure of their greatness does not come from Hollywood movies, or politicians giving speeches in Washington, or even from the unit citations handed out after the war. The truest measure of what the United States Airborne accomplished in those freezing woods comes from the cold, bewildered confessions of the German officers who survived the siege. They had marched into the Ardennes, believing they were fighting a soft, inexperienced army that relied entirely on airplanes and heavy artillery to do their fighting. Instead, they spent a week stepping into the freezing darkness of the Bois Jacques and trying to hunt down men who had turned the darkness into their own personal weapon. The Germans learned that when you surround the American infantryman, cut off his supplies, freeze him to the bone, and demand his surrender, you do not break him. You simply remove his requirement to hold back. You strip away the rules of conventional warfare, leaving only a predator in the snow who has already decided that he is never going home, and he is going to take as many of you with him as the night will allow.